The red and blue lights from the patrol car flashed across the shiny surface of the red sedan as it pulled over to the side of the road. Officer Jack Thompson stepped out of his vehicle, his boots crunching softly on the gravel. He adjusted his utility belt, his eyes narrowing as he approached. The car had been speeding, but something else had caught his attention: the nervous behavior of the driver. Jack had seen that kind of uneasiness before. Hands gripping the wheel too tightly, shifting eyes that refused to make contact. It was a subtle sign, but one Jack had learned to notice over his years on the force. He reached the driver's side window, which had already been rolled down. Before he could speak, however, his gaze was drawn to something else entirely. In the passenger seat sat a golden retriever, calm and alert, its amber eyes meeting his with a steady gaze. Jack froze. For a moment, he forgot the reason for the stop. The dog looked exactly like Hank, a dog he had once known. Jack had met Hank years ago while investigating a criminal case. The dog had vanished under mysterious circumstances, and Jack had never been able to forget him. Now it felt like he was staring at a ghost. Jack cleared his throat, forcing himself to focus. "Sir, do you know why I pulled you over?" he asked, his voice steady but distant. The man behind the wheel nodded, though his movements were tense. "Yeah. Speeding, right?" Jack gave a slight nod but couldn't stop glancing at the dog. "What's his name?" he asked, his tone now softer, more curious than official. The driver seemed taken aback by the question but answered, "Hank. I've had him for about 2 years now. He just showed up near my place one day. Looked scared out of his mind. Took a while to gain his trust, but after that, he never left." Jack felt a chill creep up his spine. Hank. The same name. The same breed. Even the dog's eyes carried that same familiar warmth he remembered. The odds of this being a coincidence were too small to ignore. He took a step back, his mind racing. Could this really be the same Hank? And if it was, how had he ended up here, sitting in the passenger seat of a stranger's car after all these years? Jack's instincts told him that this encounter wasn't just random. He needed answers. Jack stood near his patrol car, the cool breeze brushing past him as he tried to make sense of what he had just seen. His mind kept returning to the golden retriever, Hank. There was no mistaking the similarity. It wasn't just the name or the breed. It was something deeper, something in the dog's calm, knowing eyes. The odds of this being a coincidence seemed slim. Still, how could he explain this to anyone without sounding crazy? He needed more answers before taking the next step. Jack walked back to the red sedan, his boots crunching softly on the roadside gravel. The driver, Michael Hayes, sat stiffly, his hands resting tensely on the steering wheel. His fingers tapped lightly, his eyes occasionally flicking toward Hank, as if silently questioning what might come next. Jack took a moment to observe the man's body language before leaning down to speak through the window. "License and registration," Jack said, keeping his voice calm and professional. "Right? Yeah," Michael mumbled, hurriedly reaching for the glove compartment. Papers, napkins, and loose change tumbled out as he fumbled around. After a few moments, he handed Jack the documents, his hands trembling slightly. Jack noticed but didn't comment. He examined the paperwork in silence. Michael Hayes, a local resident, clean record, nothing suspicious. Still, the nervous energy radiating from the man told Jack there was more beneath the surface. After a moment, Michael broke the silence. Is there a problem with Hank?" he asked, glancing nervously at the dog. Jack shook his head slowly. "No, it's just strange," he said, pausing as he chose his words carefully. "I knew a dog named Hank once. Looked exactly like yours. Same eyes, same calm demeanor. Strange coincidence, don't you think?" He watched Michael's reaction closely. The man's face tensed for a moment before he gave a small, uneasy chuckle. "Yeah, I guess it is," Michael said quietly. He rubbed the back of his neck. "He showed up near my property a couple of years ago. Looked rough, like he'd been on the run. I took him to the vet, no chip, no tags. I tried to find his owner, but nothing. I figured he was a stray. He's been with me ever since." Jack nodded thoughtfully. He knew there was more to the story, There had to be. The timeline, the lack of identification, and the eerie resemblance weren't something he could just ignore. Hank wasn't just another lost dog. Jack felt the weight of unfinished business bearing down on him. Whatever had brought Hank back into his life wasn't random, and Jack knew he couldn't walk away from it. Jack sat in his patrol car, the dashboard computer glowing faintly in the fading light. He typed in Michael Hayes' information, his fingers moving slowly, his thoughts elsewhere. The system returned the expected results. No criminal record, valid registration, nothing out of the ordinary. Still, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He leaned back in his seat, eyes drifting to the sedan parked ahead. Through the windshield, he could see Michael talking softly to Hank, who remained calm and attentive. The sight brought back a rush of old memories. 3 years ago, during a search of an abandoned house tied to a drug operation, Jack had found Hank. The dog had been malnourished and terrified, but showed an uncanny resilience. Over the following weeks, Jack had formed a bond with him, visiting the shelter frequently. He'd been ready to adopt Hank when, out of nowhere, the dog had vanished. The shelter staff claimed someone had taken him, though no records could confirm it. It had been one of those unanswered mysteries that had haunted Jack ever since. Now, sitting there, it felt like fate was giving him a second chance. He couldn't let this slip away again. Jack sighed, turning off the computer. He grabbed his notepad and stepped out of the car. The cool evening air seemed heavier than before. He walked slowly back to the sedan, rehearsing his next words in his mind. He didn't want to spook Michael, but he needed to learn more. Michael watched Jack approach, tension creeping back into his posture. Jack stopped beside the window and tapped lightly on the frame. "Everything checks out," he said casually. "But I do have a question for you. Would you mind telling me a bit more about how you found Hank?" Michael's eyebrows furrowed slightly, and he hesitated before answering. "It was kind of strange, to be honest. I was driving back from work late one night, out near some farmland. I saw him on the side of the road, just sitting there. He didn't run or bark, just stared at me. I pulled over, and when I opened the door, he hopped right in like he was waiting for me." He paused, his eyes distant as if replaying the moment. "He looked scared, but I don't know. It's like he trusted me right away." Jack nodded slowly, processing the details. "And you've had no issues since? No signs of anyone looking for him?" Michael shook his head. "Nope. Took him to the vet the next day, had him checked out. He was underweight but healthy. No microchip, no ID. I asked around a bit, but no one claimed him." He glanced at Hank, who had shifted slightly to rest his head on Michael's arm. "I stopped questioning it after a while. Figured I was just lucky he found me." Jack frowned slightly, the pieces falling into place in a way that didn't sit right with him. Something about the dog's sudden reappearance all those years ago and now ending up here didn't feel like luck. There was more to the story, he was certain of it. But for now, he decided to keep that thought to himself. Jack crossed his arms and leaned slightly against the side of the sedan. The story Michael had just told replayed in his mind. Finding Hank on a deserted road, no identification, no trace of an owner. It all fit with how the dog had mysteriously vanished from the shelter years ago. But there were too many gaps, and Jack's gut told him something wasn't adding up. He took a deep breath and decided to press a little further. "You didn't see anyone around when you found him? No cars nearby, no signs of anything strange?" Jack asked, keeping his tone conversational but watchful. Michael shook his head. "No, nothing. It was just him out there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, I thought it was weird, but I figured maybe someone dumped him there. Happens a lot in rural areas, unfortunately." He frowned and ran a hand through his hair. "I've always wondered if he was running from something, though. He had this nervousness at first, like he was always on edge. Took a few weeks for him to fully settle in." Jack listened carefully, filing away every word. If Hank had been dumped or escaped, it would explain why he had disappeared so suddenly. But something about this didn't feel random. The dog had shown up at just the right time, in both his life and Michael's. Jack glanced at Hank, who was now resting quietly, his eyes half closed but still aware of the conversation. "Yeah, Dogs like that usually carry some baggage, Jack said thoughtfully. He paused for a moment before adding, you ever had any incidents? Anyone coming around, asking about him? Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned back in his seat. No, nothing like that. Why? Is there something I should be worried about? His tone shifted slightly, more defensive now. Jack shook his head quickly, not wanting to alarm him. No, nothing like that. Just curious. Sometimes dogs that come out of situations like that have a history. People looking for them, old connections. I've seen it happen before. He kept his gaze steady, watching how Michael reacted. There was a flicker of doubt in the man's eyes, but he didn't push for more information. Jack decided to ease up for now. He had enough to think about, and he didn't want to raise unnecessary suspicion. But deep down, he knew this story wasn't over yet. Jack stood in silence for a moment, the distant hum of cars on the highway barely audible. His mind turned back to that case from 3 years ago. The house where Hank had been found was in shambles, a hideout for drug runners who had vanished before the raid. Hank had been one of the few living things they'd discovered inside. The dog had been scared, but not aggressive. Jack had stayed with him until animal control arrived, a small but memorable connection forming between them. That bond hadn't faded, and seeing Hank now was like reliving those moments all over again. Michael cleared his throat, breaking the silence. Look, officer, I don't really know where Hank came from, but if there's something I need to know, I'd appreciate if you told me, he said cautiously. His eyes were serious, with a mixture of curiosity and worry. Jack shook himself out of his thoughts and met Michael's gaze. It's nothing you need to worry about right now, he replied carefully. Like I said, I just knew a dog like him before. He disappeared under some strange circumstances. Seeing Hank here kind of threw me for a loop. Michael frowned, his fingers tapping on the steering wheel again. Strange circumstances? What kind of circumstances? He asked, now clearly more invested in the conversation. Jack hesitated. He didn't want to reveal too much yet, not without more facts. It was a case I worked on a few years back. The dog I knew was caught up in some bad stuff. I always wondered what happened to him. He paused, then added, but it's probably just a coincidence. Dogs like Hank, they have a way of showing up when you least expect it. Michael seemed to ponder Jack's words for a moment before nodding slowly. Yeah, I get that. Hank came into my life when I was going through a rough patch. It's like he knew I needed him. He glanced at the dog, a small smile forming on his lips. Hank's ears perked up slightly at the sound of his name, and his tail gave a slow wag. Michael's expression softened. He's been a lifesaver for me, honestly. Jack observed the bond between the two and felt a pang of understanding. He'd seen firsthand how dogs could anchor people in their darkest times. Still, he couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that Hank's reappearance wasn't just fate or chance. There were too many unanswered questions. Jack had a hunch that the past they both shared with Hank would come knocking soon enough. Jack returned to his patrol car but didn't start the engine right away. His thoughts weighed heavily on him as he stared through the windshield at the red sedan ahead. Hank's reappearance gnawed at him, raising more questions than answers. What were the chances that this dog, once tied to a criminal case, had ended up miles away, with a new owner, and no one ever came looking for him? Jack wasn't a believer in coincidences, and his instincts told him that there were still threads of the past waiting to unravel. He tapped the dashboard lightly, debating his next move. Officially, he had no reason to dig any further. Michael Hayes seemed like an ordinary guy. His story checked out, his records were clean, and Hank didn't appear to be in any danger. Still, Jack couldn't shake the idea that something or someone might eventually resurface. If those involved in the old case found out where Hank was now, would they come looking for him? Jack had seen enough cases to know that loose ends had a habit of coming back to haunt people. His thoughts were interrupted by a crackling voice over the radio. Unit 4, status check, the dispatcher called. Jack picked up the radio and responded, Unit 4 here. Traffic stop cleared. No further issues. Resuming patrol, he placed the radio back on its holder, letting out a slow breath. Technically, the stop was over, but the situation still didn't sit right with him. He made a quick note of Michael's name and address in his patrol log. He wasn't sure if he'd ever need the information, but something told him to keep it handy. Stepping out of the car once more, Jack approached the driver's side window. Michael looked up, his expression curious but less tense than before. "Everything's good," Jack said. "I'm not giving you a ticket, but I'd advise you to watch your speed in the future." He hesitated for a moment before adding, "Also, if you ever notice anything unusual, someone asking questions about Hank or acting strange around your property, just give me a call." Michael blinked, his brows knitting in confusion. "You think someone might come looking for him?" "Probably not," Jack said quickly, waving a hand dismissively. "Just covering all bases. Sometimes things have a way of circling back when you least expect it. Better to be prepared." He handed Michael a business card with his contact information. Michael accepted it slowly, nodding in understanding but clearly still puzzled by the warning. Jack gave Hank one last glance before stepping back toward his patrol car, his gut telling him this wasn't the last time their paths would cross. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon as Jack drove slowly through the quiet streets, his mind still on the encounter with Hank and Michael Hayes. Streetlights cast long shadows on the road ahead, their flickering glow adding to Jack's uneasy feeling. He couldn't shake the sense that someone, somewhere, had been keeping tabs on Hank all this time. Maybe it was paranoia, or maybe his instincts were sharper than he gave them credit for. Either way, his gut told him this wasn't over. Jack's patrol route brought him past the edge of town, where sprawling farmland and wooded areas stretched into the distance. It wasn't far from where Michael had claimed he found Hank. Jack slowed the car and pulled off onto a dirt path, curiosity pulling at him. The memory of the case 3 years ago kept circling in his mind. If there had been anyone else tied to that case, someone who had a reason to keep the dog hidden, maybe they'd left clues around the area. He stepped out of the car, the crisp night air biting at his skin. Flashlight in hand, he scanned the area, listening to the distant rustling of leaves. The darkness pressed in, deep and silent, but something about it felt watchful. He had been in situations like this before, silent tension that crept in, making every shadow feel like a pair of eyes. Slowly, he moved further down the path, shining the beam of light across the surrounding trees and tall grass. For a moment, he thought he saw movement, a faint figure shifting in the distance. But when he focused the light, there was nothing there. His pulse quickened. He stood still, ears straining to catch any sound. The trees whispered softly in the breeze, but beyond that, there was silence. Jack frowned, shaking his head. Maybe his nerves were getting the better of him. Still, he couldn't ignore the sense of being watched. After a few minutes, he turned back toward the car, keeping his steps steady and calm. He wasn't going to let fear get the best of him, but he couldn't deny the tension in the air. When he reached the patrol car, he paused for a moment to scan the surroundings one last time. He caught no further signs of movement, but the feeling of being observed lingered. Jack climbed into the car and locked the doors, his fingers tightening around the steering wheel. Something about this night wasn't right. As he drove back toward town, his thoughts returned to Michael and Hank. If someone was watching, how long had it been going on? And what did they want? Jack resolved to check the records from the old case in the morning. He had to be sure that no loose ends from the past had come back to endanger Hank, or anyone else. The next morning, Jack arrived early at the police station, the air still carrying a chill from the night before. The quiet hum of the building surrounded him as he made his way to the records archive. He hadn't slept much. The feeling of being watched in the woods lingered in his mind, and he needed answers. If there were any loose ends tied to the old case where Hank had been found, now was the time to uncover them. Jack sat at one of the archive terminals, typing in the case number he still remembered from all those years ago. The system loaded slowly, the screen flashing case files, photographs, and reports. He scrolled through the summary. The case had been officially closed after the suspects fled the scene. Several arrests were made later, but no one had ever been charged with anything related to the house where Hank had been found. Most of the evidence had been sparse: personal belongings, damaged property, and, of course, Hank. He clicked on the section marked witness statements. One entry caught his attention. A neighbor had reported seeing a man leaving the property a few hours before the police raid. According to the statement, the man had been carrying what looked like a duffel bag and was accompanied by a dog. Jack's eyes narrowed. The description of the dog was vague but matched Hank's breed and size. The man had never been identified, and the lead had gone cold after the raid. Carrying a dog, Jack murmured to himself, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. Had this man been Hank's original owner, or someone trying to protect him? Jack's thoughts raced as he tried to piece it together. If this person had connections to the drug ring, there could still be people out there with an interest in Hank. He made a mental note to revisit the witness and see if they could recall any more details. Just as he was about to close the file, a name stood out on one of the police reports. Mark Ellison. Jack recognized the name immediately. Ellison had been one of the suspects tied to the drug operation. Although he had never been directly connected to the abandoned house, his network had been suspected of trafficking illegal goods through rural properties. Jack frowned. Ellison had been released from prison less than a year ago. If he was active again, he could be a threat. Jack leaned back in his chair, the pieces slowly clicking into place. If Ellison or someone in his circle had known about Hank, they might still be watching. Jack couldn't ignore the possibility anymore. He grabbed his phone and dialed dispatch. "This is Officer Thompson. I need a records pull on Mark Ellison. Any recent activity, especially in the last 6 months." He hung up and stared at the screen, his jaw tightening. Whatever was going on, Jack knew he was racing against time to stay ahead of whoever else might be looking for Hank. By mid-afternoon, Jack received a call from dispatch with updates on Mark Ellison. The news wasn't good. Ellison had recently been spotted in nearby towns, making contact with individuals known to be part of his old network. There were no reported crimes tied to him yet, but Jack knew better than to wait for things to escalate. He quickly reviewed Ellison's last known locations and noted that one of them was close to the area where Michael had found Hank 2 years ago. Jack's unease deepened. It felt like the past was tightening its grip. Jack drove toward Michael Hayes' address, his mind racing with worst-case scenarios. If Ellison or anyone else from his old crew was looking for Hank, Michael could be caught in the middle without even realizing it. Jack gripped the steering wheel tighter as he replayed their conversation from the night before. Michael hadn't seemed aware of any danger, but Jack knew things could change in an instant. He needed to warn him properly this time. When Jack pulled into Michael's driveway, the golden retriever was the first to greet him. Hank trotted toward the patrol car, tail wagging, his eyes lighting up with recognition. Jack couldn't help but smile as he crouched down to pat the dog's head. "Hey, buddy," he murmured. Hank leaned into him, calm and friendly as ever. But Jack sensed a heightened awareness in the dog's posture, like he could feel the tension hanging in the air. Michael stepped out onto the porch, looking curious but not alarmed. "Officer Thompson, everything all right?" Jack stood up and nodded. "Can we talk inside for a minute?" Michael's expression shifted to one of concern as he led Jack into the house. Hank followed, settling by Michael's feet as they took seats in the living room. Jack wasted no time. "Look, I need to be honest with you. I think someone might be interested in Hank. There's a man named Mark Ellison who's tied to an old case I worked on. The same case where I found a dog that looked just like Hank." He paused to let the information sink in. Michael's eyes widened, and he leaned forward. "Wait, are you saying someone might come after him? Why? What does Hank have to do with this guy?" Jack sighed. "I don't know for sure, but Ellison's been moving around the area, and if he's looking for loose ends from his old operation, Hank could be one of them. Maybe the dog saw something or was used to move contraband. I don't know. What I do know is that we can't take any chances. I need you to stay alert and report anything suspicious." Michael nodded slowly, his face a mixture of fear and determination. Hank, sensing the tension, rested his head on Michael's knee, his quiet presence grounding them both. The sun was setting as Jack parked his patrol car a short distance from Michael's house, choosing to remain discreet. He had decided to stay close that evening, keeping watch from a distance in case anyone suspicious showed up. His instincts told him that the situation was coming to a head. If Mark Ellison was involved, Jack couldn't afford to underestimate him. The man had connections and a reputation for tying up loose ends. Hank might have been considered one of those loose ends. From his position, Jack could see the faint glow of lights inside the house. Michael was likely keeping to his routine, though Jack had warned him to be extra cautious. A sudden movement at the edge of the property drew Jack's attention. He turned off his headlights and reached for his binoculars. In the distance, near the tree line, a dark figure moved quietly through the shadows. Jack's pulse quickened. Whoever it was, they were trying to stay hidden. Jack radioed dispatch. Unit 4. Possible trespasser near a residential property. Requesting backup, he said in a low voice. He placed the radio back and quietly exited the car, moving carefully across the gravel road. As he approached the edge of the property, he heard faint rustling. The figure had stopped moving, perhaps sensing that someone else was nearby. Jack drew his flashlight but didn't turn it on just yet. He needed to stay unseen for a little longer. The next sound he heard made his blood run cold. The faint click of a door latch. He shifted his focus back to the house and saw Michael opening the back door, stepping outside with Hank. Michael must have noticed something unusual outside and gone to investigate. Jack cursed under his breath. He hurried forward, breaking from cover. "Michael, get back inside," he called out in a hushed but urgent tone. Michael froze for a moment, his eyes darting toward Jack, then toward the trees where the figure had been. Hank's ears perked up, and he let out a low growl, sensing danger. Jack reached him just in time, putting a hand on his shoulder. "Get back in the house. Someone's out here," Jack warned, his voice steady but firm. Michael didn't argue this time. He and Hank quickly retreated inside, locking the door behind them. Jack turned his attention back to the woods. The figure had vanished, but Jack knew they were still out there. Backup arrived within minutes, and together, the officers swept the area, finding faint tracks leading away from the property but no sign of the intruder. It wasn't over yet, but Jack felt a sense of clarity. Whoever was watching had been scared off, at least for now. He knew he couldn't watch over Michael and Hank forever, but he could ensure that the right protections were in place. The past had resurfaced, but Jack was determined to close this chapter once and for all.